The way I paint with gouache is entirely about how I learned to paint as an oil painter. So I started out about 15 years ago taking an oil painting class, and I really loved it. I'm also a writer, and one of the things about oil painting is it's all about revision. You get a lot of chances to do something over because the paint stays wet and you can keep working on it. So oil painting really appealed to me, but over the years I've gotten into gouache. And actually, I think a lot of oil painters do this. They sort of take up gouache as a way to work in a sketchbook or to do something smaller or quicker or just to mix things up a little bit. But I think the sketchbook aspect of it is especially nice because as oil painters, we're usually painting on a canvas and that feels so permanent and so real. And this is a nice alternative. So for me, painting in gouache means building up layers. So the first thing I did here is I put down a kind of an orangey layer over the whole scene. And this was just no particular orange. It was just kind of what was left on my palette from the last time I painted. And I really let that dry. I mean, it has to be completely dry. So make sure that the paper isn't even cool to the touch. It needs to feel, room temperature. Once you've done that, you can come over and start painting on top, and the layers won't bleed together very much. So I brushed in a very simple light sky. I didn't want to cover up all that orange because the scene that day there was sort of an orangey glow from the sun. Plus, I just like the way it looks. The thing about putting down a color like this over the whole thing is it kind of unifies the painting because little bits of it will show through. So that's something that I got from oil painting. Another thing that I got from oil painting is this idea of, kind of painting back to front. So starting with the thing most off in the distance, and that's the sky. It's almost always the sky. And then this is Mount Hood. I live in Portland, Oregon. This is a scene of, I just took this picture when I was out on my walk and I just thought the mountain looked particularly great. So I dropped that in. Mount Hood off in the distance, but otherwise it's just kind of like a little neighborhood street scene. And the hills that you see off in the distance there, I'm keeping them really, really blue. So, you might look at those hills in real life and think, well, they look kind of green to me. They are faded off in the distance, but they still seem kind of green. But I wanted to exaggerate that sense of them being pushed off into the distance so I get more contrast with the trees in the foreground. So you'll see that in just a minute. So as the paint has dried here, I just decided to come in and layer on a little bit more sky color, a little bit more white. When you're layering colors up like this, sometimes it can help to put a thin layer down, let that dry, see what you think. Once it's completely dry, build another layer up on top. This is the thing I think people sometimes miss about gouache is it's just such excellent potential for layering in that way. So, all right, working back to front, I did the sky, I did the mountain, I did the hills that are kind of in front of the mountain, and now I'm looking at the buildings that are off in the distance. So like I have this view into downtown Portland, and I don't want to get too complicated with these buildings because they're going to be pretty much obscured by the trees. So they should be something that you're not really paying too much attention to. So I'm just dropping in like some gray for the windows, and a lot of these buildings are white or sort of light in color. So I'm keeping them very consistent. I'm not trying to have a ton of variety there because this is, again, it's sort of background material. It's something I really don't, you really don't need to be even looking at that much. So I need to give this a second to dry. And while I'm gathering up paints for what's coming next, I'll just say that mostly I use Daniel Smith gouache. They make great watercolors and they've started to make gouache. And I also use Holbein gouache. Those are the two I like the best. I've bought some tubes of Winsor Newton and other brands and not been super happy with them. So that's what I do. So the next layer from the buildings coming forward are some trees that are kind of sort of still off in the distance. So what I'm trying for is a grayish green. I want them to be green, but with a lot of a lot of gray in them and some white. By the way, one thing I'll say about my palette, so I usually use just a white dinner plate. I pick these up at the thrift store, and I will leave, gouache dries, right? And so I'll basically just leave that old dried gouache on the palette and just use it to mix things with when I start the next painting. I'll run it under the sink to get the big kind of pools of paint off, but any little small piles of paint that are dried there and sort of like a little chunk of paint on the palette, I will leave that. And it's nice to just have a tiny bit of whatever random color I was working with before to dip into. So I got those trees off in the distance. I want to let that dry for a minute. So that's why I'm going to go ahead and move really forward in the foreground and get a few other things in, because I just want to let everything I've done be completely dry before I go on. So while I'm waiting for that to happen, I'm just going to do the street and the sidewalks and get that in and let that start to dry. Generally, when I have a scene like this where there's going to be cars or people, I kind of like to get the whatever the sidewalk color is going to be, or the ground, if it's grass or whatever it might be. I kind of like to get that down and then do the cars on top of that. Or I'll do the same with water. Like I'll kind of get the water in and then paint the boats on top rather than the other way around. So, and I'm fine with sort of covering over my little drawing of the cars just a tiny bit. That's fine. So I brought the photo up so you can see what I'm working with. And you can see how off in the distance, see how the hills are pretty blue. You can see how the sky's got a tiny bit of pink in it. But now I'm really ready to start working on these trees. And my trick with trees is I want to do the darkest part of the tree first and then come in and set some lighter areas on top. So I'm very accustomed to painting conifers because I live in Portland, but the way I'm doing this is I'm just mixing in really dark colors for the more shadowy parts of the tree first. And the colors I like to use for this, it's surprisingly great to use Payne's Gray with just a tiny bit of yellow in it. It'll push it just a little bit green. So that's really terrific. Holbein also just makes a color called dark green, and that's a pretty great color. It's actually not quite dark enough for these purposes, so I might push a little Payne's Gray into that. And then also like Prussian blue is kind of a bluish green, so that can be really useful too. So I'm looking at all these trees. Right now what I'm thinking about doing is just getting the darker areas of all this foliage in, because now everything's on pretty much the same plane. I mean, some of the trees are a little bit further away than others, but they're all within like half a block of each other. So pretty much we're now working in, foreground, middle ground kind of territory. So I'm going to keep mixing up some really, some different versions of the darkest green, but, different versions of that, but all still just the darkest values. And then I'll wait and I'll do lighter ones next. Another thing that can be really helpful with these dark greens is to work in a little brown or orange. So I happen to have a little bit of orange on my palette, and if I mix that with my dark green mixtures, it'll just turn it a little bit brown. It'll make it look a little more earthy and not so bright and because I want a pretty realistic color. I don't want like a super saturated, almost pop art looking color. And to make these leaf shapes, I'm just using a small brush. This is a long round 4, and the brand it's a Princeton Velvet Touch. And I'm just sort of dropping in little leaf shapes. I wouldn't even be putting this much detail in if the tree was further away, like for those for the Douglas firs that are off in the distance there. I was really just using the corner of a square brush and just giving the suggestion of, the shape of the tree. So I want to really emphasize that there's dark areas and light areas. That's most of what makes a tree look like a tree, make it look convincing and realistic. And then I start coming in with some lighter colors once I feel the darks are pretty well established. And I really kind of like the way that looks. There's little bits of orange still showing through, and you'll see me kind of mess around with that, but we'll keep going here. So at this point, I really can just, move around the page and work on whichever ones I want, but I've got like little shrubs that are below this bigger tree, and they've got a darker side and a lighter side. So I'm kind of just playing around with that and moving back and forth and getting some of those in. One thing that's really important is to have real variety in the greens. So, now I'm using kind of a lime green, and I tend to just like to mix these with a yellow, and I think lemon yellow is a really good color for getting these super kind of chartreuse sort of colors. I do have permanent green light, and that's a whole bean color, and I almost never use that right out of the tube. You can see a little bit of it on my palette there. It's not a very realistic looking green, but you add some orange or yellow to that, and it can be sort of a good basis for some light greens. But I'm also going to want kind of like a bluish green or an orangish green. Like I really want to think about a variety of different, because this is a variety of different trees and shrubs. And also still really thinking about the shadowy areas that are super, super dark. So I have that mixture and I can keep dipping back into it. And I want to sort of frame that somewhat lighter color tree with the darker colors that are behind it. So it's just about sort of giving it a sense of depth and drama, and also just those differences, like the contrast between light and dark makes it interesting, like makes it exciting. So I always want to look for places where I can really push that. So I'm just continuing to look at, what colors do I have on my palette and where can I sort of drop them into this landscape. There's a bright yellow tree in the foreground, and I decided to make it a little bit more of a light green than the bright yellow. I don't know why. I just felt like it would unify. I guess I just thought it would kind of unify the color palette a little bit. I am going to do that red tree in the corner there, but other than that, I sort of like this unified feeling of all these greens. So I'm continuing to just kind of work my way around, use the darkest colors near the ground, like where the plants are sort of touching the ground or getting closer to the ground. So I'll keep dropping those in as I go. This little brush, this little number 4 long round is really useful for a lot of this foliage. And one thing to remember about brushes with gouache is to use the right shape for what you're trying to do. You can almost just draw with it like I did right there. You can go straight down on the page so that you're just using the point, and you can also lay it down flat and drag it. So like really thinking about all the different ways that you can use that shape and reaching for different shapes of brushes when it's, when it might be more helpful. The other thing I'll say about this stage is that I'm mindful of the fact that, first of all, this is kind of a casual little painting for me, right? So it's in a sketchbook. This is what I call a visual diary, where I do little paintings of what I see, as I go about my day. So this is meant to show just what my average day looks like through my eyes. And this is just me coming down the hill at the end of a walk. So it's something I see every day. And at the end of this, I'll give you a link to a flip through of another visual diary, and you can get an idea of what that means. Oh, and also, this is probably a good time to say that this is a Stillman and Burn sketchbook, and it's the Zeta paper. So the Zeta paper is really heavy, so it can definitely handle gouache, and it's very, very smooth, so you get no texture whatsoever. And I really like this for gouache. I like it for mixed media. It can handle watercolor, but it's not their best watercolor paper. They also do Beta, and Beta is really their very best watercolor paper. But this does pretty good for watercolor. So Anyway, that's the one I like to use, and I like this square format. It's kind of fun. Um, because I'm painting on every page, I always tuck a piece of paper behind the page I'm painting on, just so I don't get paint on the next page or the pages don't get stuck together. And I always put a piece of paper, like on the left there, I've clipped down a piece of paper just so I don't splash paint on, the painting that was there before. So now I'm just getting in this tree on the right. It's a little bit lighter in color, and you can see a lot of light coming through it. Like you can see a lot of sky coming through it. So I'm trying to like capture both of those things. I, usually I don't really like to do trees where I feel like I'm dropping in every little leaf, but in this case, I do want to be able to see the sky. I probably could have done this one with a bigger brush and just had big chunks of color and it still would have made sense. And I might do that for the little red tree that's coming up. So you'll get to see that in just a second. But still remembering to add some darker tones where I see them, kind of like in the middle of the tree. And as you get down closer to the ground, you see those darker colors. And then, so here with this red tree, I will just go ahead and do like a few really big shapes for the darker areas and then mix some white in so that I can get the lighter areas. And sometimes this takes some adjusting. Like I do the first one and I'm like, I don't really like the look of that. I think I need to work in a little more white. And just so you know, in case you're curious, I used a mixture of red ochre, but also a little bit of permanent rose, which is a Winsor Newton color, to get the kind of reddish color of that. But that's another situation where I'm also reaching in and grabbing a little bit of orange or, whatever else is on the palette just to kind of mix it up and make it look not quite so saturated. So a lot of that stuff I kind of want to give a minute to dry and just think about. So I'm going to go ahead and add in some green for the kind of like lawn areas around the sidewalks there, just the little strips. And I know I want to redefine those curbs and really make it feel like, what it is, like curb, sidewalk, all of that. So I do need to get around to these cars. And I want to keep these as simple as possible. I don't need to get into hyper realism. Cars can be sort of stressful if you're not used to doing them. So I'll try to walk you through kind of my process, but it really does come down to just like painting a ton of cars and you start to get a little more comfortable with it. So the underneath of cars is always very, very dark, just pretty much black. So you can just pretty comfortably do a little black line and a couple little black marks for the tires. And that's what just about every car is going to look like. So I want to get that sense of the tires and the undercarriage of the car and really make sure that's obvious. And I'm not too concerned with like getting the colors of these cars exactly right. It's not what the painting's all about. So they're going to be pretty similar at first. Like they're reflecting the sky and the sky is kind of grayish. So there's a blue cast, but it's kind of gray. So I want to get that in all the windshields and, all the places where it's really, because I want those to all look kind of unified and kind of similar. I want you to just sort of glance at the cars and go, oh, I see there's some cars parked on this street, but not get too hung up on it. And I will go around and try to like make this car somewhat blue. The car in the foreground on the left there is like a black car that's got light coming down on it. But I might as well, I was not going to do the truck in red, but I thought, well, I am going to want a little bit of red for the lights. I love putting in the lights on a car. So I am going to need to just get out some red and just kind of make that happen. But the other thing I'll say before we get to it, you'll see me do this in person. You'll see me do this for real in a minute, but I'll just also say that I'm mindful of the fact that I can use a little bit of colored pencil to just sort of play with some of these details. So I don't really need to get everything. I can come back and mess around in colored pencil a bit too. And so I'm always, at this stage, I'm always sort of thinking, I think this is good enough with paint and we'll see what else I can do. All right, so I'm just sort of defining the cars a tiny bit, trying not to overwork them too much. So this whole painting, I sped this up to double time, but so it took me about an hour. And that's as much time as I want to spend on a little painting that's just going to live in my sketchbook that I'm just doing for fun, right? It's a super fun hour, super glad to do it, but I don't need to stress myself out and make everything perfect. And also, as we're getting close to the end of this, I'll say that I send out a newsletter about art, and I'll put a link below. It's on Substack. And then there's also a subscribe. Well, you get it every Friday in your inbox, but there's also a thing where you can subscribe for a few dollars a month and get a lot of video lessons like this. They're all about working in a sketchbook in one way or another, not necessarily with gouache. Sometimes it's markers, sometimes it's watercolor. It's all kinds of things. And there's plenty of stuff for beginning artists in there. So if you're just getting started, there's lots of things for you, but there's also this massive archive of like on-site sketching when I was in Italy or traveling, various places around the world, and drawing people and doing landscapes, doing cityscapes. So lots of stuff. I'll put the link. You can go check that out. This is actually, it's really feeling like it's coming together. Like I put some little lights on that car on the right, and these others are looking, they're looking vaguely like cars, but again, I'm gonna clean that up a little bit with colored pencil in just a minute. So I'm really at this point, this is the moment of like, okay, what do I need to finish this up? Like this tree could use a tree trunk, so I'll put that in. I've decided I'm not going to bother with the telephone poles and the wires, which I actually kind of like. And a lot of times, especially with a drawing, I really love to put telephone poles in, but I just love the way this is looking. So I think I'm just going to leave that. Some branches up in the trees. I don't need a ton of that, but just a little sense of those branches could be kind of nice. And so I'm just going around like, okay, what are a few other tiny little brush strokes I could drop in? Like maybe I clean up some of the area around these cars just a little bit more of a shadow underneath there. This is what I kind of call the bling layer. So the bling layer is at the very end where you're just sharpening things up and you're maybe adding in some highlights, some places where you really want everything to seem really bright, but also some areas where maybe you need something to be a little bit darker so that so that the drama is there, right? Okay, a little bit of work on the curbs there so that they actually feel like curbs would be a good thing. I'm messing around with the sidewalk just a bit. And you can see that there's a lot of the orange still showing through, and that's good. Like that is what helps to kind of unify it all. So I'm not looking to cover up every little bit of that. But there might be a few places like, oh, I should drop in a shrub there. That just looks like I sort of forgot to paint it. So there's a few places, adding some more darks in there. Where I just want to touch things up just a tiny, tiny bit. A little bit of shadows, maybe a little texture, so this doesn't just look like a one stroke of paint, but it actually kind of looks like grass a little bit. So that's the other nice thing is when you're working in layers with gouache like this, you can actually take a pretty dry layer of gouache and add it on top and get kind of some texture with that. So this is where I come back in with colored pencils. I really love the Caran d'Ache Luminance colored pencils for this and just about everything else. They are a little more expensive, but they actually last quite a bit longer. So I think they're a good value. You can put light colors. So like I can get a white or a light colored pencil and add a little highlight here and there. Or come in with darks and just fill in a tiny little detail, like just a very fine line that would be hard to get with a paintbrush and is so easy to do with colored pencil. So maybe I fill in a little bit, like suggest some tree branches here and anything I want to color in. Sometimes I want to do a tiny bit more of coloring in some of those gaps in the trees, stuff like that. I can do all that with colored pencil. And yeah, I'm just taking some greens and adding in a few tiny little leaf details. Not really necessary. I'm pretty happy with how this turned out. So Please feel free to like this video, subscribe, but also come check out my newsletter. And I'll put a link to that, but I'll also put a link to a flip through of an entire visual diary like this one that's all gouache paintings of just things I see every day out and about living my life. Thanks very much. I hope you enjoyed it.